Okay, so the first year of the war is what Grimsley calls the conciliatory part of the war. And again, this isn't a phrase Lincoln used, but it's a very, I think, tidy way of thinking about the Civil War. Now, what's going to happen is that by the summer of 62, a year into the war, Lincoln realizes that he's mistaken about Southern whites, that he's going to have to see the war through to the end. The Southern whites are going to have to be conquered if they're going to be brought back into the Union. And it's at that point, according to Grimsley, or well, he gives a vocabulary to it, that the Civil War becomes a hard war. So in Grimsley's model, we have a transition from a conciliatory war in which there is fighting, of course. Lincoln does send armies into Virginia, into Kentucky. But again, he's just trying to make it a chess piece war, where it's just army versus army, and civilians aren't involved, and slavery and emancipation is not an issue. And what happens in the summer of 1862 is it becomes what Grimsley calls a hard war. And that's the more grim war, but the very positive side of that, of course, it becomes a war of emancipation. So this is the way I want you to think about the Civil War. The Civil War happens in two parts. Initially, Lincoln is very conciliatory towards civilians in the South, although he's trying to, he does send armies there, but he just wants it to be an army versus army conflict without civilians involved, without the question of emancipation coming to the fore. But by the summer of 62, and we haven't gotten there yet, Lincoln has made a calculation that things aren't going well. This conciliatory policy that he come up with, don't touch slavery, don't touch property, has collapsed really in the face of reality. And at that point, Lincoln moves towards emancipation. So the Civil War becomes something that it wasn't in the second year of the war. It becomes what Lincoln calls a remorseless and revolutionary conflict. And we don't think in U.S. history in terms of revolution very much. We're kind of scared of revolutions, except for the American Revolution. But this is what I want you to realize about the Civil War, that it evolves into a revolutionary conflict which leads to the emancipation of 4 million human beings, slaves, that in strictly economic terms, there was more wealth piled into the bodies of slaves in the U.S. than in any other industry in the United States combined in the 1860s. It's a huge, emancipation is absolutely a huge moment, probably the most important thing in the history of the United States. Now, clearly it doesn't lead to a racial paradise. No one in well, I guess some people would, but they're kind of idiots, would argue that the United States is a racial paradise in 2016. Nonetheless, emancipation, hugely important moment in the history of the U.S. But Lincoln doesn't start there, he gets there, okay? So the big kind of overall picture when you're thinking about the Civil War is the first year, Lincoln wants a chess piece kind of war, army versus army. The second year of the war, Lincoln gets much more dramatic, what Grimsley calls a hard war. The war becomes much fiercer. It becomes much more a war about emancipation, and civilians in the South are getting caught up into it as well. Okay, so that's kind of the model of the Civil War. The conciliatory war in the first year, and it moves to a hard war beginning in the summer of 62 when Lincoln decides to move towards emancipation. I think this is one of the key things that most people don't understand about the Civil War, that the Civil War evolved into something that it had not begun as, if that's correct English. It changes its shape. It becomes much more revolutionary than any white person had wanted in April of 1861. Now, of course, African Americans always wanted the war to become a revolutionary war. And they're saying to Lincoln, you're an idiot. You can't fight the war without fighting slavery. What are you thinking? But Lincoln, for various reasons, he wants to bring the white South in, and as I talked about yesterday, he can't move too early because of Kentucky, especially. If he moves too early towards emancipation, he'll lose Kentucky. And for Lincoln, losing Kentucky meant losing the Civil War. But by the summer of '62, he's got Kentucky in hand through military force, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. So that allows him to move as well. So that's the way I want you to think about the Civil War. That it evolves from what Grimsley calls a conciliatory conflict to a hard war. Here's the second thing I want you to think about. There is no single strategic plan for defeating the South until the spring of 1864. So for 3 years, the North is fighting the Civil War without an overall strategic plan of defeating the South. Now what you have is you have armies in the East, and I'm going to talk about that in the next podcast, especially when I'm talking about the East. I'm talking about Virginia in particular. Virginia is really kind of even to this day, it's the centerpiece of the war. It's where a lot of people focus. But then you also have Union armies in the West. And these two armies are not acting in tandem. They're kind of doing their own thing. They're attacking the Confederate Army in their own way, on their own schedule. And so this is something else that a lot of people don't understand about the Civil War, that it takes 3 years until the spring of 1864 until the Union comes up with an overall strategic plan where it's moving in uniformity in a coordinated way, both in Virginia and in the western states, to defeat the Confederacy. And the person that creates that overall strategic plan is Ulysses S. Grant, who's my hero and who's going to play a big role in the war, or in this course. But we're not there yet. So this is another way I want you to think about the Civil War. It's not a coordinated conflict against the South. And this is one of the things that causes problems for the Union Army. It's a little bit helter-skelter. Different generals in different regions are doing their own thing with very little overall coordination. Okay, so those are kind of the big picture things I want. I guess the third thing, since I have a couple minutes on this podcast, one of the things that's a real advantage for the South early in the war is the South's best generals were in the Eastern Theater. Lee doesn't emerge until '62. Stonewall Jackson. The South's best generals were in Virginia. The South's worst generals were in places like Kentucky and Tennessee and Mississippi. So the A-team for the South in terms of officer corps and generalship was Virginia. It's just the opposite for the Union in the first couple of years of the war. The Union's best generals, U.S. Grant, Sherman, they're in what we call the West. Of course, it's not the West today, but this is, when I'm talking about the West, I'm talking about Kentucky and Mississippi. This is just kind of the Civil War vernacular. So the A-team for the Union in the early years of the Civil War in terms of generalship was in the West with Grant and Sherman. And the generals in the East were really second rate, and they're always getting their ass kicked by Lee until Grant shows up there in 1864. So I guess I can, those are kind of big picture things. And now in the next podcast, I'm going to kind of get into more of the nitty gritty of fighting the war. I think some of you probably thought that's what this whole course would be about. And here we are in late mid-February, and I'm just getting